When I received the group text about the Thompson family reunion plans and realized I wasn't included, I knew something was seriously wrong. But when I discovered they were using the resort reservation I had secretly paid for months earlier, I made a decision that would expose years of manipulation and change our family forever. What happened next revealed a truth so shocking that it transformed not just my relationship with my daughter-in-law, but the entire foundation of how our family understood love, loyalty, and the price of keeping devastating secrets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone has called me Maggie for as long as I can remember. At 67 years old, I've lived through enough family drama to recognize when something isn't quite right, but nothing had prepared me for what was about to unfold in my own household. I spent 35 years as a high school guidance counselor before retiring, which means I've seen every type of family dysfunction imaginable. I thought I understood people, thought I could read the subtle signs of trouble brewing beneath polite surfaces. I was wrong. The Thompson family reunions had been my pride and joy for over 2 decades. Every summer, we'd gather somewhere beautiful, somewhere that would create lasting memories for the grandchildren, and give all of us a chance to reconnect away from the distractions of daily life. I'd started the tradition when my late husband, Paul, was still alive, back when Ryan was just a teenager complaining about spending time with boring relatives. Now, 23 years later, these gatherings had become the cornerstone of our family's identity. I live in a comfortable ranch house in suburban Denver, the same house where I raised Ryan and his younger sister Amanda. The walls are covered with decades of family photos, and my kitchen table has hosted countless heart-to-heart conversations over coffee and homemade cookies. My neighbors often joke that I'm the unofficial grandmother of the entire street, always ready with advice, a casserole for someone who's sick, or a listening ear for whatever troubles people want to share. Ryan married Jessica 3 years ago, and I genuinely thought I'd gained not just a daughter-in-law but a friend. Jess seemed perfect for my son, someone who balanced his sometimes overly serious nature with her bubbly enthusiasm and creative spirit. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, often spreading her projects across my dining room table when she visited, while I'd make us tea and we'd chat about everything from color theory to her childhood in Oregon. The grandchildren, Olivia and Noah, were from Jess's previous relationship, but Ryan had embraced them completely, and I'd done the same. Olivia, at 8 years old, had inherited her mother's artistic talents and spent hours at my house creating elaborate drawings that I'd proudly display on my refrigerator. Noah, 6 and endlessly energetic, loved helping me in my garden, his small hands carefully planting seeds while he chattered about everything and nothing. For 3 years, our blended family seemed to work beautifully. Weekly Sunday dinners at my house became a cherished routine. Holiday celebrations were warm and inclusive. When Jess suggested we should start alternating hosting duties to share the load, I was happy to agree. When she offered to help plan the annual reunion because she had fresh ideas and connections in the hospitality industry, I welcomed her input gratefully. The first subtle changes began about 8 months ago, right around the time discussions for this year's reunion started heating up. Our weekly Sunday dinners became every other week, then monthly, with Jess explaining that the kids had more activities now, that Ryan was working longer hours on a big project, that they were trying to establish their own family traditions, all reasonable explanations that I accepted without question. The holiday celebrations shifted too. Instead of the large gatherings we'd always enjoyed, Jess suggested smaller, more intimate celebrations. Quality over quantity, she'd say with that bright smile of hers. The kids get overwhelmed with too many people around. Again, it made sense. I wanted what was best for Olivia and Noah, so I adjusted my expectations accordingly. When family members started asking me about reunion details I couldn't answer, I initially thought it was just a communication mix-up. My sister Betty called in March asking about the dates because she needed to request time off work. I told her I'd check with Jess and get back to her, assuming the planning was just running behind schedule. My niece Carol texted asking about the location because she wanted to coordinate carpooling with other cousins. I promised to follow up, but every time I asked Jess about the reunion planning, she seemed harried and overwhelmed. Oh, Maggie. I'm so sorry. I've been swamped with client deadlines. Can we talk about it next week? Became her standard response. Next week would come, and there would be another deadline, another crisis, another reason why the reunion discussion had to be postponed. By April, family members were getting more persistent with their questions, and I was getting embarrassed by my lack of answers. Frank, my brother who lives in Phoenix, called specifically to discuss travel arrangements. Maggie, I need to book flights soon if I'm going to get decent prices. Where are we going this year? The uncertainty in my voice. When I told him I'd get back to him must have been obvious, because there was a long pause before he said, "Is everything okay? This isn't like you to be so disorganized." That comment stung more than I wanted to admit. Organization had always been one of my strengths, both professionally and personally. My family relied on me to have the details handled, the plans made, the logistics sorted out. The idea that I appeared disorganized, that I was failing in one of my primary family roles, left me feeling unsettled and anxious. In May, I decided to take matters into my own hands. If Jess was too busy to focus on reunion planning, I'd step back in and handle it myself, the way I'd done for years before she offered to help. I spent hours researching potential venues, comparing prices, reading reviews, and making phone calls. I wanted to find somewhere special, somewhere that would create the kind of memories that last a lifetime. That's when I discovered Sunset Ridge Resort, a stunning property nestled in the Colorado mountains about 2 hours from Denver. The resort offered everything our family could want. Comfortable accommodations ranging from hotel rooms to family cabins, multiple dining options, hiking trails, a lake for swimming and boating, and organized activities for all ages. The photos on their website took my breath away, showing families laughing together against backdrops of pristine mountain scenery. The resort was definitely more expensive than our usual venues, but I'd been saving money specifically for family events since Paul passed away 5 years ago. This felt like the perfect use of those funds, a way to create something truly special for what I sensed might be one of our last big family gatherings, as some of the older relatives were struggling with health issues. I called Sunset Ridge Resort and spoke with Mark Johnson, their event coordinator. He was incredibly helpful, walking me through all the options and packages available. When I mentioned that we'd need accommodations for approximately 35 family members ranging in age from 6 to 82, he immediately understood the complexity of our needs and suggested a package that would give us a significant discount for booking multiple cabins and organizing group activities. The total cost was substantial, over $8,000 for the 3-day weekend I was envisioning. But as I sat in my kitchen, looking at the family photos covering my walls and thinking about how precious these gatherings had become, especially as we'd lost several family members in recent years, I knew it was worth every penny. I gave Mark my credit card information and officially booked the Thompson family reunion for the first weekend in August. After hanging up the phone, I felt a sense of satisfaction and excitement I hadn't experienced in months. I'd solved the problem, created something wonderful for our family, and could finally give everyone the details they'd been asking for. I decided to surprise Jess with the news, knowing she'd be relieved to have the planning pressure lifted from her shoulders. I drove over to Ryan and Jess's house that evening, finding them in the middle of their usual dinner routine. The kids were animated as always, Noah telling elaborate stories about his day at summer camp while Olivia showed off a new drawing she'd completed. It felt like old times, comfortable and warm, and I was excited to share my surprise. I have some wonderful news about the reunion, I announced after the kids had finished eating and gone to play in the backyard. I found the most amazing place, and I've already booked everything." The expression that crossed Jess's face was hard to interpret. Surprise, certainly, but something else I couldn't quite identify. "Oh," she said, glancing quickly at Ryan. That's great, Maggie. Tell me about it." I pulled out the brochure I'd printed from the resort's website and spread it across their kitchen table, pointing out all the features I thought the family would love. The lake, the hiking trails, the family-friendly activities, the beautiful dining room where we could hold our traditional group dinner. I was talking quickly, enthusiastically, describing how perfect everything would be. "This looks expensive," Ryan said, studying the brochure with a frown. "Don't worry about that," I assured him. "I've already paid for everything. It's my gift to the family. I want this to be a reunion we'll all remember forever." Jess was unusually quiet, asking only a few polite questions about the dates and logistics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I assumed she was simply processing the information, maybe feeling a bit relieved that the planning pressure was off her shoulders. I left that evening feeling accomplished and excited, already mentally composing the group email I'd send to the extended family with all the details they'd been waiting for. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I realized something was fundamentally wrong. I was at the grocery store, pushing my cart through the produce section, when I literally bumped into my sister Betty near the organic tomatoes. After the usual pleasantries, she started talking about the reunion plans she'd been making with other family members. "I'm so excited about the lake house rental," she said, selecting a bag of salad greens. "Carol found such a great deal and the photos look gorgeous. I can't wait to see how it compares to the places we've stayed before." I stopped pushing my cart, a cold feeling settling in my stomach. "Lake house rental?" Betty looked at me strangely. "The one for the reunion?" "The house Carol found through her friend's recommendation. Didn't Jess tell you? She sent out all the details in the group text last week." Group text. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers, scrolling through my recent messages. There were texts from Ryan about picking up milk on my way over for dinner. Messages from my neighbor asking about watering her plants while she was out of town. A reminder from my dentist about an upcoming appointment. But no group text about reunion plans. "Betty," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "can you show me this group text?" She pulled out her phone, navigating to her messages with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to text primarily to keep up with grandchildren. "Here it is," she said, holding out her phone. The group text was labeled Thompson Family Reunion 2024 and included what appeared to be every adult family member except me. The messages went back several days, with detailed discussions about cabin assignments, meal planning, activity coordination, and travel arrangements. Jess was clearly the primary organizer, responding to questions and making decisions with an authority I didn't realize she'd assumed. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the messages, seeing my family members enthusiastically discussing a reunion I knew nothing about, at a location I'd never heard of, using funds I couldn't identify. The casual tone of the conversations made it clear this wasn't a recent development. This planning had been going on for weeks, maybe months, while I'd been repeatedly asking Jess for updates she claimed she didn't have. "Maggie, are you okay?" Betty asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look pale." I handed her phone back, my mind racing through implications I didn't want to acknowledge. "I'm fine," I lied. "Just realized I forgot something at home. I need to go." I abandoned my half-filled grocery cart in the produce section and walked quickly to my car, my heart pounding with a mixture of confusion, hurt, and growing anger. During the drive home, I kept trying to find reasonable explanations for what I'd discovered. Maybe it was a surprise they were planning for me. Maybe there had been a technical error with the group text that excluded my number. Maybe Jess had simply forgotten to add me to the conversation. But deep down, I knew none of those explanations were true. I'd been deliberately excluded from my own family's reunion planning, the reunion I'd been organizing for over 20 years, the reunion I'd just spent $8,000 to make special for everyone. At home, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while I stared at it, trying to process what felt like a complete betrayal. I thought about all the times in recent months when I'd asked Jess about reunion plans and she'd deflected or delayed. I remembered the strange expression on her face when I told her about booking Sunset Ridge Resort. I recalled how quiet she'd been during that conversation, how she'd glanced at Ryan with what I now realized was panic rather than gratitude. The worst part wasn't just being excluded. It was the systematic deception, the weeks of being lied to while I repeatedly asked for information I was told didn't exist. It was the realization that my family was moving forward without me, making decisions about an event I'd created and funded, while treating me like I was irrelevant to the process. I spent that entire evening replaying conversations from the past several months looking for signs I'd missed, clues that might explain how I'd become an outsider in my own family. The weekly dinners that became monthly, the holiday celebrations that grew smaller and more exclusive, the gradual shift in dynamics that I'd attributed to natural family evolution, but now seemed more calculated and intentional. By the time I went to bed that night, hurt had transformed into determination. I needed to understand what was happening and why. More importantly, I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. The next morning, I called Sunset Ridge Resort and spoke again with Mark Johnson. I explained that there had been some confusion about our family event and asked about their cancellation policy. Mark was understanding and accommodating, explaining that since our event was still more than a month away, I could cancel with only a small penalty fee. The resort had a waiting list of people hoping for August bookings, so they could easily fill our reserved spaces. "Are you sure you want to cancel, Mrs. Thompson?" Mark asked. "This seems like such a special gathering you've planned." I looked around my kitchen, at the family photos and the empty spaces where I'd imagined displaying pictures from our reunion at his beautiful resort. "I'm sure," I said quietly. After hanging up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time, considering my options. I could confront Jess and Ryan directly, demanding an explanation for why I'd been excluded from the planning. I could call other family members and try to piece together the full scope of what was happening. I could simply show up at their alternative reunion location and force a confrontation. Or I could wait and see how long it took for anyone to realize that the reunion they were planning might have a significant problem. I chose to wait, but not passively. If my family wanted to plan a reunion without me, they were certainly free to do so. But they'd have to find their own way to pay for it. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was Carol, and she sounded frantic. "Aunt Maggie, I just got off the phone with the Lake House rental company, and they're saying our reservation was never confirmed because the credit card payment didn't go through. They need full payment by tomorrow, or they're giving our spot to someone else. Do you know anything about this?" I took a deep breath, knowing that my response to this phone call would set in motion events that would change our family forever. "Carol," I said calmly, "I think there might be some confusion about the reunion planning this year. Maybe you should talk to Jess about the payment situation." There was a long pause, but Jess said you were handling all the financial arrangements, that you'd insisted on paying for everything like you always do. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and the picture they created was more disturbing than I'd imagined. Not only had I been excluded from the planning, but my name was being used to justify decisions I'd never made and commitments I'd never agreed to. "I think," I said carefully, "that there are some things we all need to discuss as a family." That evening, my phone started ringing with calls from worried family members who were getting conflicting information about the reunion. Frank called from Phoenix, confused about why the reservation had fallen through. Betty called asking if I was having financial problems and needed help covering the costs. Other relatives left voicemails expressing concern and asking for clarification about what was happening. Through it all, neither Ryan nor Jess called me directly. By the end of the week, it became clear that the alternative reunion they'd planned was falling apart without the financial backing they'd assumed I would provide. The lake house booking was lost. Other arrangements were canceled. Family members who'd requested time off work and made travel plans were frustrated and confused. That's when I finally received a call from Jess, her voice tight with stress and barely controlled anger. "Maggie, we need to talk. Can you come over tonight?" I'd been waiting for this conversation for days, and I was ready. I arrived at Ryan and Jess's house at 7:30 that evening, my stomach knotted with anticipation and my mind cycling through the conversations I'd been having with confused family members all week. The summer sun was still high, casting long shadows across their manicured front lawn, and I could hear the children's laughter coming from the backyard where they were apparently enjoying their evening playtime, blissfully unaware of the adult drama unfolding around them. Jess met me at the front door before I could even knock, her usual bright smile replaced by a tense expression I'd never seen before. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing an old t-shirt and jeans instead of her typical put-together appearance. The stress of the week was clearly showing. "Thanks for coming, Maggie," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Ryan's in the kitchen. We thought it would be better to talk privately while the kids are outside." I followed her through the living room, noting the scattered papers across the coffee table that looked like printed emails and what appeared to be reservation confirmations from various venues. The house felt different somehow, charged with an uncomfortable energy that made me hyper-aware of every sound and detail. Ryan was standing by the kitchen island, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. My son had inherited his father's tendency to internalize stress, and I could see the tension in his shoulders and the tight line of his jaw. He looked older than his 32 years, and there were circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't been sleeping well. "Mom," he said simply, nodding toward one of the kitchen chairs. "Please, sit down." The formality of his tone sent a chill through me. This wasn't how conversations usually started in our family. We were huggers and casual chatterers, people who discussed problems over coffee and homemade cookies, not through formal kitchen table conferences. Jess sat across from me while Ryan remained standing, creating a dynamic that felt uncomfortably like an interrogation. I could see a stack of papers in front of Jess, and my heart sank as I recognized some of the documents as printed emails from the family group text I'd discovered at the grocery store. "Maggie," Jess began, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard from her before. "We need to discuss what happened with the reunion reservations this week." I met her gaze steadily, determined not to be put on the defensive in what should have been a conversation about their exclusion of me. "I think we need to discuss why I was left out of the reunion planning entirely, despite being told for months that you were too busy to organize anything." Ryan shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his wife and me. "Mom, Jess has been working incredibly hard on the reunion. She's coordinated everything, reached out to all the family members, found venues, organized activities. You can't just undermine all that work by canceling reservations behind our backs." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Undermine her work? Ryan, I spent months asking Jess for reunion details and being told they didn't exist. I booked Sunset Ridge Resort in May because I thought I was helping with planning. That wasn't getting done. I only discovered the group text by accident when Betty mentioned it at the grocery store. Jess leaned forward, her expression hardening. "Maggie, I told you I was handling the reunion planning. You going behind my back to book your own venue?" Without consulting anyone was incredibly disrespectful and confusing for the whole family. I stared at her in disbelief. "Going behind your back? Jess, every time I asked you about the reunion, you said you were too busy to discuss it. You never mentioned that you were actively planning something else entirely, or that there was a group text coordinating everything. How was I supposed to consult with planning I didn't know existed? "You could have trusted me to handle it," she snapped, and for the first time I heard genuine anger in her voice. "Instead, you assumed I was incompetent and took over like you always do." The phrase, "like you always do," hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that made my chest tighten. "What do you mean, like I always do?" Ryan sat down heavily in the chair next to his wife, running his hands through his hair. "Mom, you have to understand how it looks from our perspective. Every family event, every holiday, every gathering, you're the one making all the decisions. You plan everything, you pay for everything, you organize everything. It doesn't leave room for anyone else to contribute or have input." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me, changing the entire foundation of how I understood my role in our family. I thought I was being helpful. I thought you appreciated that I handled the logistics so everyone else could just enjoy the events. "But that's just it," Jess said, her voice rising slightly. "We never get to just enjoy them because you're constantly managing every detail, making sure everything is perfect according to your vision. Do you realize that in 3 years of family gatherings, you've never once asked me what I might want to do or what ideas I might have?" The accusation stung because as I mentally reviewed our interactions, I realized there might be some truth to it. I'd been so focused on maintaining the family traditions that Paul and I had established, so determined to keep everyone happy and connected, that I might not have left space for new ideas or different approaches. "I asked you to help with the reunion planning," I said weakly. "I thought you wanted to be involved." "You asked me to help execute your vision," Jess corrected. "There's a difference between genuine collaboration and asking someone to be your assistant." Ryan reached across the table and took his wife's hand, a gesture of solidarity that excluded me in a way that felt deliberate and painful. "Mom, we love you, and we appreciate everything you do for the family. But sometimes it feels like you don't trust us to handle important things on our own." I sat in silence for a moment, processing accusations that were reframing decades of family interactions in ways I'd never considered. Had I been controlling rather than helpful? Had my desire to ensure successful family gatherings prevented others from feeling ownership in our traditions? "Even if that's true," I said finally, "it doesn't explain why I was completely excluded from the reunion planning this year. You could have talked to me about wanting more input or different approaches. Instead, you organized an entire event behind my back while lying to me about its existence." Jess's jaw tightened. "We didn't lie to you, Maggie. I told you I was handling the reunion planning, which I was. I was working with the family to create something that would be more collaborative and less overwhelming." "Overwhelming?" The word came out sharper than I intended. "Is that how you see the reunions I've organized for over 20 years? Overwhelming?" "Honestly?" Jess met my eyes directly. "Yes, sometimes they are. The elaborate planning, the detailed schedules, the pressure to participate in every activity, the way you get upset if anyone wants to do something different or skip an event. It's a lot, Maggie." I felt tears burning behind my eyes, but I was determined not to cry in front of them. "So, instead of talking to me about any of these concerns, you decided to plan a completely separate reunion and exclude me from it entirely?" Ryan leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Mom, we didn't plan to exclude you. The group text thing was. It was supposed to be temporary. We were going to include you once we had the basic framework figured out." "When?" I demanded. "The reunion is in 3 weeks. When exactly were you planning to include me in the event I've been asking about for months?" The question hung unanswered, and in that silence, I realized the truth was probably that they hadn't planned to include me at all, at least not in any meaningful way. I would have been informed of the final arrangements and expected to participate, without having had any input in the planning process. "And what about the financial arrangements?" I asked. my voice getting stronger as my hurt transformed into anger. Carol called me this week saying that the lake house rental couldn't be confirmed because the credit card payment didn't go through, and that you'd told everyone I was handling all the financial arrangements. How exactly did that work if I was excluded from the planning? Jess and Ryan exchanged a look that confirmed my suspicions. Ryan cleared his throat uncomfortably. We thought, you always pay for the reunion costs, so we assumed. You assumed I would pay for an event I wasn't invited to plan, at a location I'd never heard of, without being consulted about the budget or arrangements? My voice was rising, despite my efforts to stay calm. You excluded me from the planning but expected me to fund it? It's not that simple, Jess said defensively. You've always insisted on paying for family events. Every time anyone offers to contribute, you wave them off and say it's your treat. We were trying to respect that pattern while also creating space for others to be involved in the actual planning. I stared at her, amazed by the mental gymnastics required to frame their deception as respect for my preferences. So, you were protecting my feelings by lying to me for months and planning an event behind my back. We weren't lying, Ryan said, but his voice lacked conviction. We were trying to find a balance between honoring your role in the family and allowing others to contribute meaningfully to our traditions. By excluding me entirely from the process? By creating space for other voices, Jess corrected, her tone becoming more defensive. Do you realize that in all the years you've been organizing reunions, you've never once asked other family members what they might want to do or where they might want to go? You decide on the location, the activities, the schedule, everything. Other people just show up and follow your agenda. The criticism hit home because I recognized there was truth in it, but it didn't justify the deception and exclusion I'd experienced. Then you should have talked to me about wanting more collaborative planning. You shouldn't have lied to me about not having time to work on reunion plans while secretly organizing everything without me. We tried to talk to you, Jess said, her voice becoming strained. But every time anyone suggests doing something differently, you get this look on your face like we're attacking the family traditions or disrespecting Paul's memory. It's impossible to have an honest conversation with you about changing anything. The mention of my late husband's name in this context felt like a deliberate provocation, and I could feel my anger building. Don't bring Paul into this. He's been gone for 5 years, and these reunion plans have nothing to do with honoring his memory. Don't they? Jess challenged. Every time we suggest modifying any family tradition, you talk about how important it is to maintain continuity, to honor the way things have always been done. You act like any change is a betrayal of the family's history. Ryan nodded in agreement. Mom, you have to admit that you can be pretty resistant to new ideas when it comes to family events. I felt like I was being attacked from all sides, criticized for caring too much about family traditions and for trying too hard to keep everyone connected. So your solution was to plan an entirely separate event without telling me, while letting me believe you were too busy to work on reunion. Planning it all? Our solution, Jess said, emphasizing the word our in a way that made it clear I wasn't included in that category, was to try to create something that would work better for everyone, including you, even if you couldn't see it at the time. How could it work better for me if I wasn't included in planning it? Because you wouldn't have had to handle all the logistics and stress of organizing everything, Ryan said, as if he genuinely believed this explanation made sense. You could have just shown up and enjoyed the reunion without having to worry about all the details. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to value honesty and direct communication, and realized he'd somehow convinced himself that lying to me and excluding me was actually a form of consideration. Ryan, do you honestly believe that excluding me from planning the family reunion I've organized for over 20 years was doing me a favor? He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. When you put it like that, it sounds bad. But you have to understand, We were trying to find a way to include other people's ideas and preferences while still respecting your role in the family. What role was that, exactly? Writing checks for events I wasn't consulted about? Jess leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Maggie, you're being dramatic. We were planning to include you in everything once we had the framework established. You would have been fully involved in the actual reunion. As a guest at an event, I was expected to fund but not plan. As a family member who didn't have to handle all the stress and responsibility of organizing everything for once, she countered. I realized we were talking in circles, with Jess and Ryan consistently reframing their deception as consideration and their exclusion as inclusion. The mental gymnastics required to maintain their position was impressive, but it wasn't changing the fundamental facts of what had happened. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, I said, working to keep my voice level. For months, while I was asking you about reunion planning and being told you were too busy to discuss it, you were actually organizing an elaborate alternative reunion with the entire extended family except me. You used my reputation for funding family events to secure reservations and make commitments, but you never actually consulted me about the budget or arrangements. And you're telling me this was all done out of consideration for my feelings and desire to reduce my stress. You're oversimplifying, Ryan said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Am I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you wanted to plan the reunion your way without my input, but you still expected me to pay for it. And when the financial arrangements fell through because I wasn't actually involved in making them, suddenly I'm the problem for not covering costs I was never consulted about. Jess stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window. This isn't getting us anywhere. The bottom line is that the reunion is in 3 weeks. We have 35 family members expecting to attend, and now we have no venue and no way to accommodate everyone because you canceled the resort reservation out of spite. The accusation of spite hit me like a slap. I canceled a reservation I made for an event I thought I was planning, after discovering that my family was organizing a completely different event without telling me. That's not spite, Jess. That's a reasonable response to being deceived and excluded. But now everyone suffers because of your reaction, she said, turning back to face me. Frank has already booked his flight from Phoenix. Betty has taken time off work. Carol has been coordinating carpools and childcare. All of that is wasted now because you couldn't handle not being in control of every detail. I stood up as well, my patience finally exhausted. All of that is wasted because you organized an event using other people's expectations about my financial support without actually securing that support. You made commitments based on assumptions rather than actual agreements. We've been making those assumptions for 20 years, Ryan said quietly. You've never not paid for a family reunion. That's because I've always been involved in planning them, I replied. I've never been asked to write a blank check for an event I wasn't consulted about. The three of us stood in the kitchen, the air thick with accusations and hurt feelings. I could hear the children's voices from the backyard, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the adult conflict playing out inside the house. So, what happens now? Ryan asked finally. The reunion is in 3 weeks, and we have no venue. I don't know, I admitted. I suppose you'll have to figure out how to fund and organize an event without assuming I'll cover the costs. That's not fair to the rest of the family, Jess protested. They shouldn't have to suffer because we had a miscommunication about planning responsibilities. They're not suffering because of miscommunication, I corrected. They're suffering because you made commitments you couldn't keep and organized an event based on financial assumptions rather than actual agreements. But you could fix this, Ryan said, and I heard desperation creeping into his voice. You could rebook the resort or help us find another venue. You could choose to prioritize the family's needs over your hurt feelings. The suggestion that I was prioritizing hurt feelings over family needs was the final straw. Ryan, I am Not responsible for fixing a problem you and Jess created by excluding me from planning while expecting me to fund everything. If you want to organize family events independently, you need to fund them independently too. So, you're willing to let the entire reunion fall apart over this? Jess asked, her voice rising. You're willing to disappoint 35 family members, including elderly relatives who might not have many more opportunities to attend these gatherings, because we didn't include you in every planning detail? I looked at this woman who had been living in my home for 3 years, sharing meals at my table, accepting my help with childcare and financial support, and realized she was trying to make me the villain in a situation where I'd been systematically deceived and excluded. Jess, I spent $8,000 of my own money to book what I thought was our family reunion venue. When I discovered you were planning a different event entirely, I canceled those reservations because they were no longer needed. I am not responsible for the fact that your alternative planning didn't include securing actual funding. But you know we can't afford to pay for everything ourselves, she said. And finally I was hearing honest admission of what this was really about. Then you should have included me in the planning from the beginning, instead of assuming I would fund whatever you decided to organize without my input. Ryan sat back down heavily, putting his head in his hands. This is such a mess. I don't know how to fix it. Looking at my son, seeing his genuine distress, I felt my anger soften slightly. Ryan, you could have avoided all of this by being honest with me from the beginning. If you and Jess wanted more control over reunion planning, you could have talked to me about it. If you wanted other family members to have more input, we could have worked together to make that happen. Instead, you chose deception and exclusion, and now you're dealing with the consequences of those choices. We didn't mean for it to get this complicated, he said quietly. But it did get complicated, because lies and exclusion always create complications. And now you're expecting me to solve problems I didn't create, using money I was never consulted about spending, for an event I was never included in planning. Jess returned to her seat, looking defeated. So, what do you want from us, Maggie? An apology? An admission that we handled this badly? Fine. I'm sorry we excluded you from the planning. I'm sorry we weren't more direct about our concerns with how family events are typically organized. Is that enough to save the reunion? Her apology felt hollow, more about achieving a desired outcome than expressing genuine remorse. It's a start, I said carefully. But I need to understand why this happened, why you felt the need to plan. Around me instead of with me. Why you were comfortable deceiving me for months while still expecting my financial support. Because, Jess said, her voice becoming strained again, every time anyone suggests doing anything differently with family traditions, you shut it down. You don't say no directly, but you get this pained expression and start talking about how important it is to maintain continuity and honor the family's history. It's impossible to have a real conversation with you about changing anything. I sat quietly for a moment, considering her words. Was there truth in what she was saying? Did I shut down suggestions for change in ways I wasn't aware of? Can you give me specific examples? I asked. Jess and Ryan exchanged glances before she answered. Last Christmas, when I suggested we could try some new recipes alongside the traditional ones, you spent 10 minutes explaining how the current menu had been Paul's favorite and how important it was to maintain those connections to family history. I remembered that conversation, and I could see how my response might have felt dismissive, even though that hadn't been my intention. I didn't mean to shut down your suggestion. I was trying to explain why the traditional recipes were meaningful to me. But the effect was the same, Ryan said gently. Your explanation made it clear that changing anything would be disrespectful to Dad's memory, so Jess felt like she couldn't pursue her idea without seeming like she didn't care about family history. The insight was uncomfortable but illuminating. I was beginning to see how my desire to preserve meaningful traditions might have come across as resistance to any change or input from others. What about other examples? I asked, genuinely wanting to understand. The seating arrangements at family dinners, Jess continued. When I suggested we could mix things up sometimes, maybe let the kids sit with different adults or have couples sit apart so people could have different conversations, you explained how the current seating plan ensures everyone feels included, and how you developed it over years of hosting. Again, I remembered the conversation, and again, I could see how my response had effectively ended discussion of her suggestion. The timing of family phone calls, Ryan added. When I mentioned that Sunday evening calls were sometimes inconvenient because it's when we're doing weekend wrap-up activities with the kids, you talked about how Sunday calls had been a tradition since I was in college and how they helped keep the family connected across busy weeks. I was starting to see a pattern in my responses that I hadn't recognized before. In each case, I'd thought I was explaining the reasoning behind existing traditions, but the effect had been to make changing those traditions seem selfish or disrespectful. I never meant to shut down your input, I said slowly. I was trying to share why these traditions were important to me, not to prevent you from having different ideas. But intentions and impact aren't the same thing, Jess said, and her voice was softer now, less confrontational. When someone suggests a change and the response is a detailed explanation of why the current way is meaningful and important, it effectively ends the conversation about alternatives. The realization was painful but necessary. I had been unconsciously controlling family dynamics by making it emotionally difficult for others to suggest changes, even though that had never been my intention. So instead of continuing to try to talk to me about these concerns, you decided to plan the reunion without me? We decided to try creating something that would incorporate more people's ideas and preferences, Ryan corrected. The plan was always to include you, just not to have you make all the decisions about every detail. But you can see how being excluded from months of planning while being expected to fund everything might feel like something other than inclusion? Both of them nodded, and I could see genuine remorse in their expressions for the first time since I'd arrived. We messed this up, Jess admitted. We were so focused on trying to create space for other people's input that we didn't handle the situation with you fairly or honestly. And now we have 3 weeks to figure out how to salvage a reunion for 35 people, Ryan added. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything I'd learned about how my family had been experiencing my involvement in our traditions. The picture that emerged was uncomfortable, but important. I had been unconsciously controlling, even if my intentions had been to preserve meaningful connections and ensure everyone felt included. But their response to my unconscious controlling behavior had been deliberate deception and exclusion, which had created an even bigger problem. I need to think about all of this, I said finally. About what you've told me about how I've been handling family traditions, and about what happens next with the reunion. Mom, Ryan said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. We really are sorry about how we handled this. We love you, and we want you to be part of the reunion. We just want it to be something that works better for everyone. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and direct, who had somehow gotten tangled up in months of deception because he didn't know how to have a difficult conversation with me about changing family dynamics. I love you too, I said. But we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust and figure out how to move forward. As I drove home that evening, my mind was spinning with everything I'd learned. The conversation had been painful and enlightening in equal measure, forcing me to confront ways I might have been unconsciously controlling, while also making it clear that Ryan and Jess had handled their concerns in the worst possible way. The Tao reunion was still 3 weeks away, and I had no idea how we were going to resolve the practical problems of venue and funding, let alone the deeper issues of family dynamics and trust that had been exposed. But for the first time in months, at least we were all acknowledging the same set of facts about what had happened. That felt like a necessary first step. even if I had no idea what the next step should be. The next morning, I woke with a headache and the heavy feeling that comes from a night of restless sleep filled with circular thoughts. The conversation with Ryan and Jess had left me emotionally drained but also strangely energized. For the first time in months, I had clarity about what was happening, even if I didn't know how to fix it. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the family photos that had always brought me comfort, but now seemed to mock the fractured state of our relationships. I needed to do something decisive, something that would force resolution, rather than allowing this situation to continue festering. That's when I decided to call a family meeting. Not a casual gathering or an informal discussion, but a real family meeting where everyone could hear the same information at the same time and we could address the reunion crisis collectively. If Ryan and Jess wanted more collaborative family decision-making, then we were going to collaborate openly and honestly. I spent the morning making phone calls to family members, explaining that there had been some confusion about reunion planning and that we needed to meet as a group to figure out the best path forward. I was deliberately vague about the details, wanting everyone to hear the full story at the same time, rather than creating a telephone game of partial information. Betty was immediately concerned. "Maggie, what kind of confusion? Is everything okay?" "There's been a miscommunication about planning responsibilities and financial arrangements," I said carefully. "I think it would be better if we all discuss it together so everyone has the same information." Frank was more direct. "Are you telling me the reunion might be canceled? Because I've already bought my plane ticket." "That's what we need to figure out as a family," I replied. "Can you change your flight to come a few days early? I'm thinking we should meet this weekend." One by one, I called the key family members who were involved in reunion planning. Carol, who had been coordinating carpools and accommodations. My cousin David, who always handled the group activities. Linda, my longtime friend who had become honorary family and always helped with meal coordination. Even some of the younger generation who were old enough to participate in adult family discussions. By noon, I had commitments from 12 family members to come to Denver for an emergency family meeting on Saturday. Some were driving in from other parts of Colorado, others were flying in from neighboring states. The urgency in my voice had clearly communicated that this was serious, even though I hadn't shared the specific details. I called Ryan next. "I've organized a family meeting for Saturday afternoon at my house. Everyone who's been involved in reunion planning will be there, and we're going to resolve this situation once and for all." There was a long pause before he answered. "Mom, I don't think that's a good idea. This is really between you and Jess and me. We don't need to involve the whole family in our disagreement. Ryan, this stopped being just between us the moment you involved the whole family in planning a reunion without including me. Everyone has made commitments and arrangements based on information they received through the group text. I wasn't part of. They deserve to understand what's actually happening." "But it's going to be embarrassing," he said, and I could hear the distress in his voice. "Airing our family problems in front of everyone." "The family problems are already aired." "Honey, everyone knows there's confusion about the reunion plans. What they don't know is why. I think they deserve honest information so they can make informed decisions about their own travel and financial commitments." Another pause. "What are you planning to tell them?" "The truth. That you and Jess organized reunion planning without including me while expecting me to fund everything. That I canceled the resort reservation I booked when I discovered the alternative planning. And that we need to figure out, as a family, how to move forward." "Jess is not going to like this," he said quietly. Then Jess should have thought about that before she spent months lying to me about reunion planning while using my name to make financial commitments to other family members. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp September weather that makes Colorado famous. My living room, which usually felt spacious, seemed crowded with 12 adults sitting in chairs brought in from the dining room and kitchen. The atmosphere was tense with curiosity and underlying concern. Betty sat on my couch, her expression worried. Frank had flown in from Phoenix and looked jet-lagged and irritated. Carol had brought a notebook, clearly expecting to take notes about whatever decisions we made. The younger family members looked uncomfortable, probably sensing that they were about to witness some kind of adult drama they'd prefer to avoid. Ryan and Jess arrived exactly on time, both looking like they were heading to an execution rather than a family meeting. Jess was wearing a dress I'd never seen before, something more formal than her usual casual style, as if she'd chosen her outfit for a job interview or court appearance. Ryan couldn't seem to meet anyone's eyes directly. "Thank you all for making the trip on short notice," I began, standing at the front of the room in what probably looked like a parental or teacher position. "I know everyone has questions about the reunion planning, and I thought it was important for us all to have the same information before making decisions about how to proceed." David raised his hand slightly. "Maggie, before you start, can you just tell us if the reunion is still happening? Because some of us have made significant travel arrangements." "That's exactly what we need to discuss," I replied. "The situation is more complicated than a simple yes or no answer." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member before continuing. "For the past several months, I've been asking Jess about reunion planning and being told that she was too busy to work on it. During that time, I was getting calls from many of you asking about dates, locations, and logistics that I couldn't answer because I was told the planning wasn't being done." Betty nodded. "I remember calling you about dates and you seemed confused about the details." "That's because while I was being told there was no reunion planning happening, Jess was actually organizing an entirely different reunion through a group text that included everyone except me." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Frank leaned forward in his chair. "What do you mean, everyone except you?" Jess spoke for the first time, her voice defensive. "Maggie, you're making this sound much more deliberate and malicious than it actually was. Then please explain to everyone what actually happened," I said, gesturing for her to stand. Jess remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. There were communication issues about planning responsibilities. We were trying to create a more collaborative approach to reunion organization, and there were some misunderstandings about who was handling what aspects of the planning. Carol looked confused. "But Jess, you were very clear in the group text about handling all the arrangements. You assigned people to bring specific dishes, you coordinated the cabin rentals, you organized activities. That didn't seem like miscommunication. And you specifically told me that Maggie was handling all the financial arrangements," Frank added, "which is why I didn't worry about the cost when you were describing this elaborate lake house setup." I could see Jess's composure beginning to crack under the weight of direct questions from multiple family members. The financial arrangements were, we assumed, Maggie has always paid for reunion costs, so we thought. "You thought I would pay for a reunion I wasn't invited to plan?" I asked quietly. The room fell silent as the implications of what had happened became clear to everyone. Linda, who had been like a sister to me for decades, looked shocked. "Jess, are you saying you organized the entire reunion without including Maggie at all?" "It wasn't supposed to be exclusion," Ryan said, finally speaking up. "We were trying to create space for other people's ideas and input. Mom can be. She likes to control all the details of family events. And we thought if we could present her with a more collaborative plan, she'd appreciate not having to handle all the logistics." Betty's expression hardened. "So you lied to her for months about there being no planning while secretly organizing everything without her?" "We didn't lie," Jess protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "What would you call it then?" David asked, and his tone carried the authority of someone who had been a corporate manager for 20 years. Because, from what I'm understanding, Maggie repeatedly asked you about reunion planning, and you told her you were too busy to work on it, while you were actually working on it extensively without including her. We were trying to protect her from having to handle all the stress and responsibility, Ryan said. But even he seemed to realize how weak that explanation sounded. Frank stood up, his face flushed with anger. Let me get this straight. You excluded Maggie from planning the family reunion she's organized for 20 years. You lied to her about the planning not happening. You used her reputation for funding family events to make commitments to other family members. And you're telling us this was for her own good? The direct challenge seemed to break something in Jess. She stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking completely. Fine. You want the truth? The truth is that Maggie controls every single family event down to the last detail, and it's suffocating. She decides where we go, what we do, what we eat, how long we stay, everything. There's no room for anyone else's ideas or preferences because everything has to be done her way, or it's disrespecting family traditions. The room fell silent at her outburst. I felt the sting of her words, but I also noticed that several family members were looking uncomfortable with her tone and accusations. Carol spoke carefully. Jess, even if that's how you feel about Maggie's planning style, can you understand why organizing a reunion behind her back while expecting her to pay for it seems dishonest and unfair? We weren't expecting her to pay for our reunion, Jess snapped. We were trying to organize something that would work better for everyone, including her. But you told Frank that Maggie was handling the financial arrangements, Linda pointed out. And when the lake house rental fell through because there was no actual payment, Carol called Maggie asking about the credit card problems. How is that not expecting her to pay? Jess looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that her explanations weren't convincing anyone. We hoped. Maggie has always been generous with family expenses, and we thought she'd want to support the reunion even if she wasn't involved in every planning detail. You thought she'd write a blank check for an event she wasn't consulted about? Betty asked incredulously. People do things differently in different families, Jess said, her voice becoming strained. In my family, we don't micromanage every detail of every gathering. The comment about her family seemed to trigger something in Frank. What exactly do you mean by that, Jess? Are you saying there's something wrong with how our family operates? I'm saying that some families are more flexible and less controlling about traditions and planning, she replied, and I could see her realizing too late that she was making the situation worse rather than better. David, who had been quiet through most of the exchange, finally spoke up. Jess, I think you need to understand something about this family's history with reunions. Maggie started organizing these gatherings after her mother passed away as a way to make sure we all stayed connected despite being scattered across different states. These reunions have been crucial for maintaining relationships that might otherwise have faded over time. And, Betty added, Maggie has always paid for reunion costs because she wanted to make sure that financial constraints didn't prevent anyone from attending. She's never made people feel obligated or guilty about the expenses because she handles them quietly and graciously. Linda nodded in agreement. For you to characterize her generosity as controlling seems to miss the point of why she's been doing this for 2 decades. I could see Jess becoming more defensive as family members spoke up, but what happened next surprised everyone, including me. Stop, Ryan said suddenly, his voice cutting through the discussion. Just stop. Everyone stop defending and attacking and blaming. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to the room. This is exactly what I was afraid would happen. This is why we didn't want to have this conversation with everyone here. He turned back to face the room, and I was startled to see tears in his eyes. Do you want to know the real truth? The truth is that I've been feeling suffocated by family expectations for years, and I didn't know how to talk about it without seeming ungrateful or hurtful. The admission hung in the air, more honest and raw than anything that had been said so far. "Mom," he continued, looking directly at me, "you've been an amazing mother and grandmother, and you've done incredible things to keep our family connected. But sometimes it feels like there's no room for me to be an adult with my own ideas about how I want my family to operate." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Ryan, what do you mean?" "I mean that every family gathering feels like a performance where we all have to play our assigned roles and follow the established script. I can't suggest doing something differently without a lengthy explanation of why the current way is meaningful and important. I can't offer to host an event without being told that your house is better suited for family gatherings. I can't even contribute financially without being told not to worry about it because you've got it covered." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that this conversation was about much more than reunion planning. This was about his struggle to establish adult independence within family relationships that had been defined when he was much younger. "I never meant to make you feel that way," I said softly. "I know you didn't," he replied. "That's what makes it so hard to talk about. Your intentions are always loving and generous. But the effect is that I feel like I'm still a child in this family, not a grown man with his own wife and children and ideas about how we should do things." Jess stood up and moved to stand beside her husband, and for the first time, I saw them as a united front dealing with a genuine problem rather than as conspirators trying to exclude me. "That's what we were trying to address with the reunion planning," she said, her voice calmer now. "We wanted to create space for Ryan to have more of a leadership role in family events, to show that he could organize something meaningful and successful." "But you went about it in completely the wrong way," Frank said bluntly. "You could have had this conversation with Maggie directly instead of lying and excluding her." "We tried to have this conversation," Ryan said, frustration creeping back into his voice. "But every time we've suggested changing anything about family traditions, Mom gets this look and starts explaining why the current way is important and meaningful. It shuts down discussion before it can really begin." I sat quietly, listening to my son describe interactions I remembered differently, but could now see from his perspective. Had I been shutting down his attempts at adult independence without realizing it? Carol, who had been taking notes throughout the discussion, looked up from her notebook. "Okay, so we have a situation where there were legitimate concerns about family dynamics, but those concerns were addressed through deception and exclusion rather than direct communication. And now we have less than 3 weeks to figure out whether we're having a reunion at all, and if so, how it's going to be organized and funded." Her summary brought us back to the practical reality that had brought everyone together in the first place. "That's right," I said. "And I think everyone deserves to know the full scope of what we're dealing with before making decisions about their own participation." I looked around the room, making eye contact with each family member before continuing. "In May, when I couldn't get clear information about reunion planning from Jess, I booked Sunset Ridge Resort in Colorado for the first weekend in August. The total cost was $8,000, which I paid in full." Several people gasped at the amount. Frank whistled. "Low. $8,000? Maggie, that's incredibly generous, but it's also a huge expense." When I discovered that there was alternative reunion planning happening without my knowledge, I canceled the resort reservation. I couldn't justify maintaining an $8,000 booking for an event that apparently wasn't needed. "But now the alternative planning has fallen through because there was no actual funding secured," Linda said, understanding the full scope of the problem. "Right. So we're less than 3 weeks out from the reunion date, we have no venue, no confirmed funding, and family members who have already made travel arrangements and taken time off work." The room was quiet as everyone processed the practical implications of the situation. Betty spoke first. "Maggie, is there any possibility of rebooking the resort?" I shook my head. "I called them after canceling to see if we could reverse the decision. but they've already filled our reserved spaces with other guests. August is peak season for mountain resorts. What about other venues? David asked. With less than 3 weeks' notice in peak summer season, finding accommodations for 35 people is going to be extremely difficult and expensive, I replied. Carol looked up from her notes. So, what are our options? I had been thinking about this question for days, and I had some ideas, but I wanted to see what solutions the family could generate collectively. What do you all think? I asked. We have a limited budget, a short timeline, and family members who have already made commitments based on the original reunion dates. Frank leaned back in his chair. Well, we could try to find a different type of venue. Maybe not a resort, but somewhere we could all stay together. A large vacation rental or a retreat center. We could scale back the plans, Linda suggested. Instead of a 3-day weekend, maybe a shorter gathering that would be easier to organize and less expensive. Carol was flipping through her notebook. Based on the group text discussions, people were expecting to spend between $200 and $300 per family for the lake house weekend. That gives us a budget of maybe $7,000 total if everyone contributes. That's assuming everyone can still afford to contribute, Betty pointed out. Some people may have already spent their reunion budget on travel arrangements. Ryan, who had been quiet during the practical discussion, suddenly spoke up. What if we hold it at Mom's house? Everyone turned to look at him in surprise. I mean, he continued, we've had family gatherings there for years. The backyard is big enough for everyone. There's plenty of parking, and people could stay in. Local hotels instead of all together at one venue. Jess was staring at her husband. Ryan, that would put all the hosting responsibility back on your mother. Not if we all help, he said, looking around the room. What if we organized it so that everyone contributes something specific? Some people handle meals, others organize activities, others manage logistics. Mom provides the venue, but everyone else handles the actual work. I felt a flutter of hope at the suggestion, but I was also wary of appearing too eager and seeming to take control again. That could work, David said thoughtfully. My wife and I could handle organizing activities for the kids. We've got experience with that from church events. Linda and I could coordinate the meal planning and preparation, Betty offered. We've done that for church dinners that serve 100 people. Carol looked up from her notes. I could handle the logistics of hotel reservations and travel coordination. I've got spreadsheets from the lake house planning that I could adapt. One by one, family members began volunteering to take responsibility for different aspects of reunion. Planning. I watched this happen with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, realizing that this was probably what Ryan and Jess had been trying to create all along, but through methods that had made it impossible for me to support their goals. What about funding? Frank asked. Even if we're using Maggie's house, there will still be significant expenses for food, activities, and accommodations for out-of-town family. We all contribute equally, Ryan said firmly. Mom has carried the financial burden for these reunions for 20 years. It's time for the rest of us to step up. But some family members may not be able to afford a full contribution, Linda pointed out gently. Then those who can afford more contribute more, Betty said. We're family. We figure it out together. I sat quietly, watching my family organize themselves into a collaborative planning group in a way that addressed Ryan's concerns about adult independence while also ensuring that the reunion could actually happen. It was exactly what I would have hoped for if I'd been able to see past my own hurt feelings and defensive reactions. But there was still the underlying issue of trust and communication that had been damaged by months of deception. This all sounds wonderful, I said finally. But I think we need to address the elephant in the room before we can move forward with collaborative planning. The room fell quiet again, waiting for me to continue. We've figured out a practical solution for the reunion, but we haven't addressed the fact that for months, Ryan and Jess excluded me from family planning while expecting me to fund everything. Even if we can organize a successful reunion now, how do we rebuild trust and prevent this kind of miscommunication from happening again? It was Jess who answered, and her voice was quiet and sincere in a way I hadn't heard before. Maggie, I owe you a real apology. Not just for the reunion planning, but for the way I've been thinking about your role in this family. She stood up, facing me directly. I convinced myself that you were controlling and inflexible because it was easier than admitting that I felt intimidated by your competence and generosity. Instead of learning from your experience and asking for guidance, I decided you were the problem that needed to be worked around. The admission was more honest than anything she'd said before, and I could see that it was difficult for her to acknowledge. I was also threatened by your relationship with Ryan and the kids, she continued. You're such a natural grandmother and family organizer, and I felt like there was no room for me to develop my own role in the family. Ryan moved to stand beside his wife, taking her hand. And I was a coward who let my wife handle my own. Issues with adult independence instead of talking to you directly about my feelings. He looked at me with an expression that reminded me of when he was a little boy who had broken something and was confessing before I discovered it myself. Mom, I love you, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for our family. But I need to be able to contribute as an adult, not just as your son who shows up and follows instructions. I felt tears burning behind my eyes as I listened to their confessions. The pain of the past months was still there, but underneath, it was relief that we were finally having the honest conversations that should have happened long ago. I need to apologize too, I said, my voice shaky with emotion. You were right that I've been controlling family events in ways that didn't leave room for your ideas and contributions. I thought I was being helpful, but I can see now that I was being possessive of traditions and resistant to change. I looked around the room at family members who had driven and flown from across the region to help solve this crisis. And I should have been teaching all of you how to organize and fund family events instead of just handling everything myself. By always taking care of the logistics and expenses, I prevented you from developing your own skills and ownership in our family traditions. The room was quiet except for the sound of several people crying softly. Frank cleared his throat. So, where do we go from here? Ryan wiped his eyes and looked around the room. We plan this reunion together, as a family, with everyone contributing, their skills and resources. And we establish new communication patterns so that we can address concerns directly, instead of working around each other. And, Jess added, looking directly at me, I learned from Maggie's experience instead of seeing her competence as a threat to my own role in the family. I nodded, feeling a sense of resolution that had been missing for months. And I learned to collaborate instead of controlling, and to trust that family events can be meaningful and successful even if they're not organized exactly the way I would do it. Carol, ever practical, looked up from her notes. So we're really doing this? Reunion at Maggie's house in less than 3 weeks, with everyone contributing to planning and expenses? The room erupted in a chorus of agreement, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely excited about our family reunion. But as family members began discussing specific planning details and dividing up responsibilities, I couldn't shake the feeling that we still hadn't addressed the deeper question of why this crisis had been necessary in the first place. Why had it taken months of deception, hurt feelings, and a near-canceled reunion for us to have honest conversations about family dynamics? What did that say about the patterns of communication we'd established over decades of family relationships? As I watched my family work together to solve the problems that had seemed insurmountable just hours earlier, I realized that sometimes the most painful crises create opportunities for the most meaningful growth. The reunion was saved, but more importantly, our family had learned something crucial about the difference between maintaining traditions and allowing them to evolve. The 2 weeks following our family meeting passed in a whirlwind of collaborative planning that felt both exhilarating and exhausting. True to their commitments, family members stepped up to handle different aspects of reunion organization with an enthusiasm that surprised me. Carol created detailed spreadsheets tracking everything, from hotel reservations to dietary restrictions. Betty and Linda developed meal plans that incorporated both traditional family recipes and new dishes that various relatives wanted to contribute. David organized a schedule of activities that would appeal to all age groups without feeling overly structured. For the first time in years, I found myself in the unfamiliar position of being consulted rather than being in charge. Family members would call or text to ask my opinion about various decisions, but they weren't waiting for my approval before moving forward with their plans. It was exactly what Ryan had said he wanted, and I was surprised to discover that I genuinely enjoyed this more collaborative approach, even though it sometimes made me feel anxious about details I wasn't directly controlling. Jess threw herself into reunion planning with an intensity that seemed to go beyond making up for her earlier deception. She coordinated with local hotels to secure group rates for out-of-town family members. She researched and organized activities for the children, creating elaborate craft stations and game areas in my backyard. She even arranged for a professional photographer to document the reunion, something we'd never done before, but which everyone agreed was a wonderful addition. Her dedication was obvious and appreciated, but there was something almost frantic about her efforts that concerned me. She would arrive at my house early in the morning to work on preparations and stay until late in the evening, often bringing Olivia and Noah with her because she didn't want to leave them with babysitters. The children seemed happy to spend time at my house, but I noticed that Jess herself appeared increasingly stressed despite the reunion planning going smoothly. 3 days before the reunion was scheduled to begin, I was in my kitchen reviewing the final head count with Carol when Jess arrived looking more agitated than I'd ever seen her. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she had dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "Maggie, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Alone." Carol looked between us, clearly sensing the tension. "I can finish this at home and email you the final numbers," she offered, gathering her papers. After Carol left, Jess sat heavily at my kitchen table, putting her head in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice muffled. "Can't do what? The reunion planning? Jess, everything is going beautifully. Everyone is so impressed with what you've organized." She looked up at me and I was startled to see tears streaming down her face. "That's not what I mean. I can't keep pretending that the reunion planning was the real problem." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Jess wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks of mascara on her cheeks. "There's something I haven't told anyone. Something I should have told Ryan before we got married. Something I should have told you when I started excluding you from family events. I've been such a coward, and now it's all going to come out anyway, and I don't know what to do." I sat down across from her, my mind racing through possibilities. "Jess, whatever it is, we can work through it. You're family now. That means we face problems together." She laughed bitterly. "That's exactly what I was afraid of. That's why I've been trying to keep you at a distance, trying to prevent you from getting too attached to me and the kids." "I don't understand." Jess took a shaky breath before continuing. "Before I moved to Colorado, before I met Ryan, I was in a relationship with someone who turned out to be involved in some very dangerous activities, drug trafficking specifically. When that relationship ended, I thought I was done with that world forever. My heart started beating faster as I began to sense where this conversation was heading. 6 months ago, I started getting phone calls. Someone had tracked me down here in Denver, someone connected to my ex-boyfriend's operation. They wanted information about his activities, information I don't have because I was never involved in the business side of things. But they didn't believe me." She was crying harder now, her words coming out in rushed fragments. "They told me they knew where Ryan worked, where the kids went to school, where you lived. They said if I didn't cooperate, they would start targeting the people I cared about to pressure me. The room seemed to tilt around me as I processed what she was telling me. Jess, why didn't you tell Ryan? Why didn't you call the police? Because these aren't people who are deterred by police reports. My ex-boyfriend is in federal prison now, but his associates are still operating, and they have connections everywhere. The person who contacted me showed me photos of Ryan leaving work, of the kids at their school playground, of you working in your garden. I felt sick to my stomach. Photos of me? She nodded miserably. That's when I realized that being close to me was putting everyone in danger. I thought if I could create distance between us, if it looked like we didn't have strong family relationships, maybe they would leave you alone. The pieces of a horrible puzzle were falling into place. So you started excluding me from family events to protect me? I thought if they saw that you weren't important to me, that we didn't have a close relationship, they wouldn't see you as leverage they could use against me. She was sobbing now. Every time I had to be cold to you, every time I excluded you from something, it broke my heart. But I was so scared of what they might do if they thought hurting you would get them what they wanted from me. I reached across the table and took her hands, which were ice cold and shaking violently. Jess, honey, you should have told us. We could have faced this together instead of you carrying this burden alone. I was trying to protect everyone, she said through her tears. But I made everything worse. I hurt you, I damaged our family relationships, and I still don't have any way to make these people leave us alone. What exactly do they want from you? Information about financial accounts, about where my ex hid money from their operations. They think I know things I don't know, and they won't accept that I was never involved in those aspects of his life. I sat quietly for a moment, trying to process the enormity of what she'd revealed. Jess, have you had any contact with them recently? She nodded reluctantly. They called 2 days ago. They know about the reunion. They know that family members are coming from out of state. They said if I don't give them what they want, they'll make sure the reunion becomes memorable for all the wrong reasons. Terror shot through me as I realized the implications. Are you saying we're all in danger this weekend? I don't know, she admitted. They might be bluffing, trying to scare me into cooperating, but I can't take that risk with everyone's safety. That's why I can't do this anymore. I have to cancel the reunion and tell everyone why. Absolutely not, I said firmly. We are not letting criminals dictate our family's decisions, and we are not facing this alone. Maggie, you don't understand how dangerous these people are. And you don't understand how protective this family can be when someone we love is threatened. I stood up and walked to my kitchen counter, where I kept a list of important phone numbers. We're calling the police, we're calling the FBI if necessary, and we're dealing with this properly. They'll know if I involve law enforcement, Jess protested. They have connections, they'll find out. Then we'll be smarter about how we handle it. I was already dialing a number. My neighbor's son-in-law is a federal agent. He's discreet, and he knows how to handle situations like this without creating more danger. As I waited for the call to connect, I looked at Jess, who was staring at me with an expression of disbelief. Why are you helping me? After everything I've put you through, after all the lies and exclusion, why aren't you angry? Because now I understand what was really happening, I said simply. You weren't trying to hurt me or control our family dynamics. You were trying to protect us in the only way you could think of. It was misguided and it caused a lot of pain. But your intentions were to keep us safe. Agent Sarah Mitchell arrived at my house within an hour of my phone call. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and a calm, professional manner that immediately put both Jess and me at ease. After introductions and a brief explanation of why we'd called her, she sat at my kitchen table and listened to Jess's story without interruption. Do you have any recordings of these phone calls? Agent Mitchell asked when Jess finished. No, I was too scared to think about documentation. What about the photos they showed you? Do you have copies? Jess shook her head. They only showed them to me on a phone screen. Agent Mitchell made notes in a small notebook. Can you describe the person who contacted you? Voice, accent, anything distinctive about how they spoke? Jess closed her eyes, concentrating. Male. Voice, probably middle-aged. No obvious accent, but he spoke like someone who was educated. He knew details about my life here that he shouldn't have known unless he'd been watching for a while. And they specifically mentioned the reunion? In the last phone call, yes. They said they knew family was coming from out of state this weekend, and that it would be easy to create problems that would look like accidents. Agent Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but I could see concern in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson, do you have somewhere else the family could gather for this reunion? Somewhere that wouldn't be predictable based on previous patterns? The reunion has been planned for my house for weeks. Changing the location now would be incredibly disruptive for 35 people who have made travel arrangements. It would also be incredibly dangerous if these threats are legitimate, she pointed out gently. Jess looked back and forth between us. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Now everyone's plans are ruined because of problems I brought into this family. Jess, stop, I said firmly. These problems aren't your fault. You didn't choose to be involved with someone who turned out to be a criminal, and you didn't choose to have his associates threaten our family. What you did choose was to try to protect us, even at the cost of your own relationships with us. Agent Mitchell nodded in agreement. Mrs. Morgan, victims of criminal intimidation often blame themselves for situations that are completely beyond their control. The people making these threats are responsible for their actions, not you. But what do we do about the reunion? Jess asked. I can't put everyone in danger just because we've made plans. Agent Mitchell was quiet for a moment, clearly considering options. There are ways to provide security for family gatherings when there are credible threats. It's not uncommon, and it doesn't have to be obvious to your family members. What kind of security? I asked. Plainclothes officers who appear to be additional family members or friends, electronic monitoring of the property to detect any unusual activity, coordination with local police to ensure rapid response if anything concerning happens. The idea of needing security for a family reunion felt surreal, but I was grateful that there were options besides canceling the event that everyone had worked so hard to organize. There's another issue we need to address, Agent Mitchell continued. These threats aren't going to stop just because the reunion is over. We need to identify who's making them and put an end to the intimidation permanently. How do we do that? Jess asked. We set up a controlled situation where they make contact with you while we're monitoring the communication. If we can trace the calls and identify the individuals involved, we can build a case for criminal charges that will put them away for a long time. The plan Agent Mitchell outlined was more complex than anything I'd ever imagined being involved in. Jess would continue to receive phone calls from the criminals, but this time the conversations would be recorded and traced. The reunion would proceed as planned, but with undercover law enforcement present to ensure everyone's safety. If the criminals made any attempt to follow through on their threats, they would be arrested immediately. This is a lot to ask of your family, Agent Mitchell warned. Everyone will need to be informed about the basic situation for their own safety, but they can't know about the law enforcement presence, or it might compromise the operation. I thought about the conversation I'd need to have with Ryan, with Betty and Frank and all the others who were traveling to Denver for what they expected to be a normal family reunion. How much do we tell them? I asked. The truth, but not the operational details. They need to know that there have been threats related to Jessica's past, that law enforcement is aware of the situation and taking precautions, and that they should report anything unusual they observe. Jess was shaking her head. I can't. Ask everyone to take this risk because of my problems. You're not asking them to take a risk, Agent Mitchell corrected. You're asking them to help us solve a problem that affects your entire family's long-term safety. If we don't address these threats now, they're likely to escalate and continue indefinitely. That evening, Ryan arrived at my house to find Jess, Agent Mitchell, and me still sitting around the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks and documents. His expression shifted from curiosity to alarm as he took in the serious atmosphere. "What's going on?" he asked, looking directly at his wife. "Jess, you look like you've been crying for hours." Jess stood up and went to him, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face against his chest. "I have so much to tell you, and I don't know where to start." I watched my son's face as his wife explained the same story she'd told me earlier. I saw his expression change from confusion to disbelief, to anger, to protective determination. When she finished, he held her at arm's length and looked directly into her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me this 6 months ago when it started?" "Because I was terrified of putting you and the kids in danger, and I thought I could handle it on my own. By excluding my mother from our family events? By lying to everyone about reunion planning? Jess, you put yourself through months of isolation and stress because you were trying to protect us?" She nodded, tears starting again. "I thought if they saw that I didn't have close family relationships, they wouldn't see any of you as useful leverage against me." Ryan looked over at me. "Mom, I'm so sorry. All those months when we thought Jess was being controlling and exclusionary, she was actually trying to protect us." "I know," I said softly. "And now we need to decide how to move forward." Agent Mitchell explained the security plan to Ryan, who listened with the focused attention he usually reserved for complex work problems. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "So we can go ahead with the reunion, but with undercover law enforcement present to ensure everyone's safety?" "That's right. And we use the opportunity to gather evidence that will allow us to prosecute the individuals making these threats." "What are the risks?" Agent Mitchell was honest in her response. "There's always some risk when dealing with criminal activity. But the risk of not addressing these threats is likely much higher in the long term. These people aren't going to lose interest and move on. They'll continue to escalate their demands and their intimidation tactics until someone gives them what they want, or until they're stopped by law enforcement." Ryan looked at his wife, then at me. "What do you think, Mom?" The question caught me off guard. For months, I'd felt excluded from family decision-making, and now my son was asking for my input on one of the most important decisions our family had ever faced. "I think we can't let criminals dictate how our family operates," I said. "And I think Jess has carried this burden alone for too long. If law enforcement believes they can handle the situation safely, then I think we should trust their expertise and move forward with the reunion. Even knowing that there might be danger? There's already danger, Ryan. At least this way we're facing it together instead of Jess facing it alone." Jess looked up at her husband. "Are you sure? I could leave town, disappear somewhere until this is resolved. You and the kids don't have to be involved in this." Ryan's response was immediate and firm. "Absolutely not. We're not splitting up our family because some criminals are making threats. We face this together, or we don't face it at all." Agent Mitchell nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. These intimidation tactics work by isolating victims and making them feel like they have to handle everything alone. When families stand together and work with law enforcement, we can usually resolve these situations successfully." The next 2 days were a strange combination of normal reunion preparation and clandestine security planning. Family members began arriving on Friday afternoon, and I watched Agent Mitchell seamlessly blend in with our relatives, introducing herself as a college friend of Jess's, who was in town for business and had been invited to join our gathering. Betty and Linda took over my kitchen, preparing traditional family recipes with the efficiency of people who had been cooking together for decades. Frank set up lawn games in the backyard while David organized craft supplies for the children's activities. Carol coordinated the arrival of out-of-town relatives, ensuring everyone found their hotel accommodations without any problems. The atmosphere was festive and warm, exactly what I'd hoped for when I first started dreaming about this reunion months earlier. But underneath the surface normalcy, I was hyper-aware of every phone call Jess received, every unfamiliar car that drove down my street, every moment when one of the children wandered away from the group activities. Friday evening, we held our traditional reunion welcome dinner in my backyard. Long tables covered with checkered tablecloths were laden with dishes that represented decades of family cooking traditions. Children ran between the tables while adults caught up on news and shared stories about their travels to Denver. I watched Jess moving through the gathering, talking and laughing with family members who had no idea what she'd been going through for the past 6 months. Her smile looked genuine for the first time in weeks, and I realized that being surrounded by family support was allowing her to relax in ways that hadn't been possible when she was carrying her fears alone. "She looks better," Ryan said, joining me where I stood on my back porch overlooking the celebration. "She does. I think telling the truth and getting help has lifted a huge weight off her shoulders. I still can't believe she went through all of this alone. I keep thinking about all the times I was frustrated with her behavior, all the times I supported her decisions to exclude you from family events, and I had no idea she was trying to protect us." I put my arm around my son's shoulders. She was doing the best she could with an impossible situation. Now we know the truth, and we can move forward together. Ryan was quiet for a moment, watching his wife help Olivia with her dinner plate. "Mom, when this is all over, I want us to establish some new family communication patterns. Not just about event planning, but about everything. I don't want anyone to ever feel like they have to handle serious problems alone again." "I'd like that," I said. "I think we've all learned some important lessons about the difference between protecting people and isolating them." Saturday morning brought perfect weather for our reunion activities. The children participated in organized games while adults rotated between visiting, helping with meal preparation, and participating in various activities that different family members had planned. Agent Mitchell continued to blend seamlessly with our family gathering, but I noticed that she was always positioned where she could observe the entire property, and that she frequently stepped away to make brief phone calls. Around noon, Jess's phone rang. I saw her face go pale as she looked at the caller ID, and she glanced around until she caught Agent Mitchell's eye. The agent moved casually in Jess's direction as she answered the call. "Hello?" Jess said, her voice steady despite the fear I could see in her expression. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Jess's face grow increasingly tense as she listened. Agent Mitchell had positioned herself close enough to overhear, and I saw her making subtle hand signals to someone I couldn't identify among our family members. "I don't have that information," Jess said into the phone. "I've told you repeatedly that I was never involved in those aspects of his business." More listening, more tension. "My family is here for a reunion. They have nothing to do with this situation." A longer pause, and then Jess's voice became firmer. "If you threaten anyone in my family, I will go to the FBI myself. These are innocent people who don't deserve to be involved in problems they had nothing to do with." The call ended abruptly, and Jess stood frozen for a moment before Agent Mitchell approached her. "How did that go?" the agent asked quietly. "They're definitely watching the house," Jess replied, her voice shaking slightly. "They mentioned specific details about cars in the driveway and people in the backyard, and they're running out of patience. They said if I don't provide information by tomorrow, they'll start demonstrating how easy it would be to hurt people I care about." I felt a chill run through me despite the warm sunshine. These weren't empty threats from people who were far away. These were immediate dangers from people who were watching our family gathering in real time. Agent Mitchell spoke into what I now realized was a concealed communication device. Target is actively surveilling the location. Repeat, active surveillance confirmed. Within minutes, I began noticing subtle changes in the atmosphere around our reunion. People I hadn't seen before appeared to be walking dogs or jogging through the neighborhood. A utility truck parked down the street. A family with children set up what looked like a picnic in the park across from my house. The law enforcement response was happening all around us, but so smoothly that most of our family members remained unaware that anything unusual was occurring. As the afternoon progressed, our reunion continued with all the joy and connection I'd hoped for. But underneath the surface, I knew we were all part of something much more serious and potentially dangerous than a simple family gathering. The real test was still coming, and by sunset, we would know whether the months of fear and deception that had nearly torn our family apart would finally be resolved, or whether the threats hanging over us would escalate into something far worse. Sunday morning dawned with an unsettling stillness that made everyone unconsciously speak in lower voices. The final day of our reunion was traditionally reserved for a large family breakfast, followed by our group photo and farewell activities. But the atmosphere felt charged with an undercurrent of tension that most family members couldn't identify, but could definitely sense. I was in my kitchen at 6 a.m, making coffee and watching Agent Mitchell through the window as she appeared to be having a casual conversation with someone I now recognized as another undercover officer posing as a jogger. Their body language suggested urgency despite the relaxed facade they were maintaining for anyone who might be observing. Jess appeared in my kitchen doorway looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing the same clothes from the day before, suggesting she'd never actually gone to bed. "Any word from your new friend?" she asked, nodding toward Agent Mitchell outside. "Nothing specific, but there's definitely increased activity. I've been watching people move through the neighborhood all morning, and it's not the usual Sunday morning routine." Jess sat heavily at my kitchen table, wrapping her hands around the coffee mug I offered her. "I keep thinking about Olivia and Noah. What if something happens during the reunion? What if I've put children in danger because I was too scared to handle this situation properly months ago? Jess, you need to stop blaming yourself for decisions you made when you were being threatened and had no support system. You did the best you could with an impossible situation. But what if my best wasn't good enough? What if someone gets hurt today because I waited too long to ask for help?" Before I could respond, Agent Mitchell entered through my back door, her expression more serious than I'd seen since she'd arrived. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. "Both of you." We gathered around my kitchen table, and Agent Mitchell opened a tablet that she'd pulled from what appeared to be a casual messenger bag. The screen showed what looked like surveillance, footage from multiple angles around my neighborhood. "We've identified at least 3 individuals who have been conducting surveillance of this property since Friday afternoon. 2 are in vehicles that have been parked in different locations around the neighborhood, moving periodically to avoid detection. The 3rd has been on foot, posing as various types of ordinary neighborhood activity." She pointed to different sections of the screen where I could see circled figures that would have been invisible to me if I hadn't known what to look for. "The good news is that we now have clear identification of the people making threats against your family. The bad news is that our intelligence suggests they're planning something for this morning, probably during your farewell activities when the largest number of family members will be gathered in one location." My blood turned cold. "Are you saying we need to evacuate everyone immediately?" "Not evacuate, but we need to modify the reunion schedule in ways that will allow us to control the situation more effectively." Agent Mitchell turned to Jess. "They're going to make contact with you again this morning. When they do, we want you to agree to meet with them." Jess's face went white. "Meet with them? Are you insane?" "It will be a controlled meeting with full law enforcement backup, but we need them to leave their surveillance positions and come to a location where we can arrest them safely without putting your family members at risk." I could see Jess's hands shaking as she processed what Agent Mitchell was suggesting. What if something goes wrong? What if they realize it's a trap? That's always a risk in operations like this, but the alternative is allowing them to continue threatening your family indefinitely, possibly escalating to actual violence if they become frustrated with your lack of cooperation. The three of us sat in silence for several minutes while Jess considered her options. Outside, I could hear family members beginning to stir, voices drifting from the guest rooms where some relatives had stayed overnight, the sounds of normal, family morning routines that felt surreal given the conversation we were having. What would this meeting look like? Jess asked finally. Agent Mitchell pulled up another screen on her tablet. There's a coffee shop about 10 minutes from here that we can easily secure and monitor. You would go there, meet with whoever they eat, send, and allow us to record the conversation while backup teams position themselves to make arrests. And my family? Would continue with reunion activities here, under protective surveillance, until the situation is resolved. Jess looked at me with an expression that reminded me of Olivia when she was trying to make a difficult decision about something that scared her. Maggie, what do you think? The question surprised me. After months of being excluded from family decisions, having Jess ask for my input on something this crucial felt both heavy with responsibility and deeply meaningful. I think you've been carrying this burden alone for too long, and I think it's time to trust the professionals who know how to handle these situations safely. But what if something happens to me? What if this meeting goes wrong and I don't make it back? I reached across the table and took her hands. Then Ryan will raise Olivia and Noah with all the love and support they deserve, and this family will make sure they always know that their mother was brave enough to face dangerous people to keep them safe. Tears started flowing down Jess's cheeks, but she nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. Agent Mitchell immediately began making phone calls, speaking in the kind of professional shorthand that made it clear she'd coordinated operations like this many times before. Within 30 minutes, my kitchen had been transformed into what appeared to be a command center, with additional agents arriving disguised as everything from family friends to delivery personnel. The most surreal aspect of the morning was watching my family members go about their normal reunion activities, while law enforcement personnel coordinated a complex operation around them. Betty and Linda were making pancakes and bacon for the traditional farewell breakfast, completely unaware that the woman helping them organize serving platters was actually a federal agent. Frank was setting up the area where we traditionally took our group photo, chatting casually with someone he assumed was a neighbor who had stopped by to admire our family gathering. Ryan was the only family member who knew what was really happening, and I watched him struggle to maintain normal interactions with relatives while obviously being consumed with worry about his wife's safety. He kept finding excuses to check on Jess, bringing her coffee, asking if she needed anything, clearly wanting to be supportive without being able to explain his anxiety to anyone else. At 9:30, Jess's phone rang. The entire command center went silent as she looked at the caller ID and nodded to Agent Mitchell before answering. "Hello?" she said, her voice remarkably steady. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Agent Mitchell monitoring the call through equipment I didn't understand, occasionally making hand signals to other personnel positioned around my house. "I understand that you're running out of patience," Jess said into the phone. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I realize that I might have some information that could be helpful to you." A pause while she listened. "Not over the phone. If we're going to discuss this seriously, it needs to be in person. Just you and me, somewhere we can talk privately." Another pause, longer this time. "There's a coffee shop called Mountain View Cafe on Colfax Avenue. I can be there in 30 minutes. The call ended, and Jess looked at Agent Mitchell with a mixture of determination and terror. They agreed to meet, but they want me to come alone, and they specifically said that if they see any indication of law enforcement presence, they'll disappear, and the threats against my family will escalate. That's exactly what we expected them to say. Agent Mitchell replied calmly. They won't see any law enforcement presence because we're very good at being invisible when we need to be. As Jess prepared to leave for what could potentially be the most dangerous meeting of her life, I found myself watching my family members enjoying what they assumed was a normal reunion breakfast. Children were laughing and playing games while adults shared stories and caught up on news from the past year. The contrast between their innocent joy and the serious operation unfolding around them was almost overwhelming. "Maggie," Jess said, appearing beside me as I stood watching the breakfast activities. "If something happens to me, I need you to know that everything I did over the past months was because I love this family too much to risk seeing any of you get hurt because of my past mistakes. Nothing is going to happen to you," I said firmly. "You're going to have that meeting. The professionals are going to arrest the people who have been threatening us, and then you're going to come back here and take the family photo that we've been planning for weeks." She smiled through tears that she quickly wiped away before anyone else could notice. "I hope you're right." Ryan appeared at Jess's other side, slipping his arm around her waist. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I can be for something I never imagined having to do." He kissed her forehead gently. "I love you. We all love you, and we'll be right here waiting for you to come back so we can finish this reunion properly." Agent Mitchell approached our small group. "It's time," she said quietly. I watched Jess walk to her car with the kind of casual demeanor that suggested she was simply running an errand during the reunion. But I could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she gripped her car keys, and I knew she was terrified, despite her brave facade. The 45 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I moved through the motions of normal reunion activities, helping serve breakfast, chatting with family members, organizing games for the children, all while my mind was completely focused on what was happening at a coffee shop 10 minutes away. Ryan was clearly struggling even more than I was. He kept checking his phone, looking toward the driveway as if he could will his wife to return safely, and making distracted conversation that didn't fool anyone, even though family members couldn't identify exactly what was bothering him. At 10:20, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Package delivered safely. All items secured. Return shipment en route." I showed the message to Ryan, who visibly sagged with relief. "Is that what I think it is?" "I think it means the meeting went according to plan, and Jess is safe." 15 minutes later, 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway almost simultaneously. Jess got out of the first car, looking exhausted but unharmed. Agent Mitchell emerged from the second vehicle, and 2 other agents I hadn't seen before exited the third car. The entire family gathered in my living room as Agent Mitchell addressed the group for the first time in her official capacity, rather than as Jess's college friend. "I need to explain some things that have been happening during your reunion weekend," she began, and I watched family members' expressions shift from curiosity to concern as they realized this was not a casual conversation. Agent Mitchell explained the threats that had been made against Jess and our family, the months of fear that had driven Jess's behavior, and the law enforcement operation that had been conducted during our reunion to resolve the situation safely. "The individuals who were making these threats have been arrested," she concluded. "They're facing federal charges that will result in significant prison sentences, and there is no longer any danger to your family." The room erupted in a mixture of relief, anger, and protective concern for Jess. Betty immediately went to embrace her, followed by Linda, then Frank, then other family members who wanted to express support and love for someone they now understood had been trying to protect them. "Why didn't you tell us what was happening?" Carol asked. "We could have helped somehow." "I was afraid that involving more people would make the situation more dangerous," Jess replied. "I thought I could handle it alone and keep everyone safe by creating distance between us. But that's not how families work," Frank said firmly. "When someone threatens one of us, they threaten all of us. We face problems together, not separately." David nodded in agreement. "Jess, you've been part of this family for 3 years. That means we protect you, not the other way around." I watched this exchange with a profound sense of gratitude and validation. This was exactly the kind of family support system I'd always hoped we were building through our traditions and gatherings, but seeing it in action during a real crisis was more powerful than I'd ever imagined. Ryan stood up and addressed the I need to apologize to everyone, especially my mother. For months, I supported Jess's decisions to exclude Mom from family events because I thought she was being controlling and we needed more independence. I had no idea she was actually trying to protect us all from genuine threats. He looked directly at me. "Mom, I'm sorry for not trusting your judgment about family relationships. I'm sorry for making you feel excluded and unappreciated, and I'm grateful that when we finally told you the truth, your first instinct was to help us solve the problem rather than to blame us for creating it." The apology was more than I'd expected, and more healing than I'd realized I needed. "Ryan, you were trying to support your wife during what you thought was a difficult adjustment to family dynamics. That shows exactly the kind of loyalty and love that makes me proud to be your mother." Agent Mitchell, who had been quietly observing our family interactions, spoke up again. "If I may make an observation, this situation could have been resolved much more easily if Mrs. Morgan had felt comfortable asking for help when the threats first began. Family support systems are one of the most effective resources people have when dealing with criminal intimidation." Jess nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "I know that now. I was so used to handling problems alone that I didn't know how to accept help, even from people who love me." "Well," Betty said with characteristic practicality, "you're going to have to learn, because this family doesn't let people face serious problems by themselves." The conversation continued for another hour, with family members sharing their own experiences of facing difficult situations and how family support had made the difference between despair and hope. It became clear that our reunion had transformed from a simple social gathering into a profound discussion about what it really means to be family and how we protect and support each other through genuine crises. Eventually, Agent Mitchell and her colleagues departed, leaving us to process what had happened and figure out how to conclude our reunion on a positive note despite the morning's drama. "I think we should still take our family photo," Linda suggested. "After everything we've been through this weekend, we have something worth commemorating." Everyone agreed enthusiastically, and we gathered in my backyard for what turned out to be one of the most meaningful family photos we'd ever taken. Instead of the usual formal arrangement, we clustered together in a way that emphasized connection and support, with Jess positioned prominently in the center, surrounded by family members who were making it clear that she belonged with us completely and permanently. As family members began preparing for departure, making plans for future visits, and promising to stay in better contact, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically our family dynamics had changed over the course of one weekend. The reunion that had almost been canceled due to deception and hurt feelings had become the catalyst for deeper honesty and stronger connections than we'd ever achieved before. The crisis that could have torn us apart had instead taught us invaluable lessons about trust, communication, and the difference between protecting people and isolating them. That evening, after all the out-of-town relatives had departed and Ryan's family had gone home to rest after their ordeal, I sat in my quiet house processing everything that had happened. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see Jess's number on the caller ID. "I know you're probably exhausted," she said when I answered, "but I needed to call and say thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For seeing past my behavior to what was really happening. For not giving up on our relationship, even when I was pushing you away. For teaching me what real family support looks like." I felt tears starting again, something that had been happening frequently over the past few days. "Jess, you don't need to thank me for caring about you. That's what family does. But it's not what I'd experienced before marrying Ryan. I Didn't know that families could work the way yours does, with unconditional support and genuine care for each other's well-being. I was so afraid of losing that kind of love that I almost destroyed it by trying to protect it. The love was never in danger, I assured her. Even when we were all confused and hurt, the foundation was still there. We just needed honesty to build on it properly. Maggie, would you be willing to help me learn how to be the kind of family member who contributes positively instead of just trying to avoid causing problems? The question touched me deeply because it suggested that Jess wanted to move beyond the crisis and actively participate in building stronger family relationships. I would love to help with that. But I think I need to learn some things too, about leaving space for other people's ideas and contributions instead of managing every detail myself. Maybe we can learn together, she suggested. I'd like that, very much. 6 months later, our family held another reunion, this time planned collaboratively from the beginning, with input from everyone who wanted to participate. The event was smaller than our traditional gatherings, but the relationships were deeper and more authentic than they'd ever been before. Jess had become one of the most active organizers, bringing creative ideas and infectious enthusiasm to every aspect of the planning. But more importantly, she'd become confident in asking for help when she needed it and honest about her limitations instead of trying to handle everything alone. Ryan had stepped into a more active leadership role in family activities, taking responsibility for coordinating between different family members and ensuring that everyone felt included in planning processes. His confidence in contributing adult perspectives to family decisions had grown tremendously once he understood that asking for help wasn't a sign of inadequacy. As for me, I'd learned the profound difference between being helpful and being controlling, between maintaining traditions and preventing them from evolving. The reunion planning had become more collaborative and creative, incorporating new ideas while still honoring the connections and continuity that made our gatherings meaningful. One evening during that later reunion, as I watched Olivia and Noah playing with their cousins while Jess and Ryan worked together to coordinate the next day's activities, I reflected on how much stronger our family had become through facing a crisis that could have destroyed us. We'd learned that love isn't about protecting people from all difficulties, but about facing difficulties together with honesty and mutual support. We discovered that trust isn't about never having problems, but about how we handle problems when they arise. Most importantly, we'd realized that the strongest families aren't those that avoid conflict and challenges, but those that have the courage to work through conflict and challenges together, emerging more connected and understanding than they were before. The threats that had seemed so overwhelming and destructive had ultimately become the catalyst for the most meaningful growth our family had ever experienced. Sometimes the very things we fear will tear us apart become the foundation for building something stronger and more beautiful than we'd ever imagined possible. As I tucked Olivia and Noah into bed that final evening of our reunion, Olivia looked up at me with the kind of serious expression that 8-year-olds sometimes get when they're processing big concepts. "Grandma Maggie," she said, "Mommy told me that she used to be scared to be part of our family because she thought she might hurt us somehow." "That's right, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups worry about things that turn out not to be as scary as they thought. But now she knows that families help each other when scary things happen." "Exactly. That's what families do. We take care of each other." Olivia smiled and snuggled deeper into her pillow. "I'm glad Mommy learned that. I like it better when everyone is together." As I turned off the light and closed the door, I realized that Olivia had summarized in one simple sentence what it had taken the rest of us months to understand. Families are stronger together, and love grows when it's shared rather than protected through isolation. The reunion that had almost been canceled due to fear and misunderstanding had become the foundation for a new chapter in our family's story, one built on trust, honesty, and the unshakable knowledge that we could face anything together. Looking back, I can see that the text message that started this whole journey the one that seemed like such a betrayal and exclusion, was actually the beginning of the most important transformation our family had ever experienced. Sometimes what looks like rejection is actually protection. And sometimes what feels like the end is really just the beginning of something far more beautiful than we'd ever dared to hope for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.